Welcome back to part two of my conversation with Stefan Legge. In this episode, we talk more about government debt, the idea of extreme government reduction, such as what's going on in Argentina and potentially the US, and whether or not this government reduction could be beneficial in a country like Switzerland. Enjoy. I wanted to now ask you about, because I was thinking, what happens to countries? Like, how do they ever recover from extreme cases? And then I was trying to, in preparation for this interview, wrap my head around what's going on in Argentina and what's been going on there since Javier Milei has been president. So I've been trying to understand essentially extreme government reduction. And I don't really have a clear picture about whether this extreme change has a net positive, at least in the long term. So I wanted to get your view on that.
Well, Argentina runs a very important experiment. And I think one of the things we should do a bit more often is look at other countries and what they do and what works and what doesn't work. Argentina is quite interesting because it's actually a country, probably the only one we've ever seen that was among the rich countries and has fallen down to middle income level. That tells you just how bad the situation is. And you see the numbers of inflation, for example, 200+%. So inflation is so high that you typically measure it on a monthly basis rather than, as is usual, on a yearly basis. So the situation is really bad. And then the question is, what can you do? And one attempt that is hardly practiced or exercised is drastically cut the size of the public sector. And we will see how it plays out. There are many people, many economists who sort of lean towards a small government position. For them, it's very important that this experiment will actually pay out. But what is clear that many of the public expenses and many of the regulations, they exist because there are people who benefit from that. And so if you cut the government, on the one hand, that means less government spending. On the other hand, it means deregulation. There will be a lot of losers. There will be a lot of people who currently benefit from that spending and that regulation. Give you an example, welfare spending. If you cut welfare spending, then certainly in the short run, many people will be worse off and there will be more poverty. Will Milei be able to survive this politically if many of these people take it to the streets? We'll see. Another example, regulation, rent control, for example. We have rent control in Switzerland as well. Rent control is fantastic for the people who have rented an apartment many years ago because their rent doesn't go up. And you see it also here in Switzerland, that people who have been in the same apartment for 20 years, they pay a rent which is far lower than what you would pay for a similar apartment on the open market. And so if you get rid of that regulation, obviously in the short run, and maybe even in the long run, many will be worse off. Might be good for the whole country, but it's certainly creating a lot of losers along the way. And so it's a very interesting experiment in Argentina, and we should pay close attention to it.
Have you seen a lot of economic positives coming out of this? I can imagine that one of the ways in which you would measure success is the amount of money flowing into Argentina because of the investment into the future. Is that also happening?
Yes. Right now, I think it's still early days of this transformation. So I think international investors are still hesitating to invest in Argentina because it's still unclear whether Milei will actually succeed with his reforms. But of course, that is one indicator to watch. So first of all, what you will see or hope to see is that inflation actually comes down. The next thing that you want to see is growth picking up. So the economy obviously falls into a deep recession. If you cut government spending so dramatically, recession is almost inevitable. But you want to see signs of recovery of the economy and then foreign investment coming back in. So I think it will take some years, but so far the early signs are quite promising. Inflation has come down. And most surprisingly, probably, is that the poll numbers for Milei are actually quite strong. I mean, that tells you something, because usually if a politician cuts government spending and cuts regulation, he or she won't be very popular. But the situation was so bad in Argentina that people might actually support him, even though the country goes through a very, very tough time.
Do you think, 'cause if this is a success, then this is a potential blueprint for other countries to adopt? But I wonder if it's even possible to go through something like this if things aren't as extreme as what Argentina was before they started it. So if you took a country like the US or Germany or basically anywhere where there seems to be complaint about too much regulation, do you think it has to get a lot worse before something like this begins to change?
Hopefully not. But I see your argument that often the situation has to be pretty dramatic before any reform has a chance of finding a majority in a democratic country. Yes, but I hope we can address problems earlier than that. And that goes for too much bureaucracy or inefficient spending or climate change. Take climate change as an example. How long do we have to wait? How much damage has to be visible before we take serious action? So far, we haven't done much because CO2 emissions are continuing to rise. And so I would hope that we can spot a problem and address it before things get really terrible.
I like what you said when you go through something like this, there are a lot of losers. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard to understand if something like this is a net positive, because depending on the information source, if they are on the side of the winners or the losers, you get a very different report in terms of how things are going. And it seems to be so polarizing.
Exactly. And don't forget, many people don't know ex ante in advance whether they will be on the winning side or not. And just this uncertainty of how will this all affect me can lead to what is known in the literature as the status quo bias. So even if you have reforms which make most of the country overall better off and most of the population will benefit, it can still be something that the majority of the people will reject simply because they don't know how exactly they will fare under this reform. And so take an example. You mentioned too much bureaucracy and too much regulation and too many exceptions and rules, etc. Imagine, for the income tax, we would get rid of all exceptions, all deductions, etc. No, we make it plain and simple. This is your income. There is a certain percent you have to pay, and that's it. Would you support that? Well, certainly you would then think, but I lose that deduction and that deduction. But how much will the, tax rate come down? And the very fact that this is uncertain tells you, well, should I really risk it? And maybe then the inclination of many people is to say, well, let's stay with the status quo.
Yeah, and I think for topics like this, I mean, you need a PhD in macroeconomics to barely begin to understand the proper consequences. And for the average person like me who spends 15 minutes on their way to work listening to a podcast about it, it depends on the person speaking that forms my decision. This is a lot of things. This is politics, this is economics. As everything's so global and everything is so complicated, forming an opinion that's rounded is for me, it's almost impossible. Because if I listen to one expert one day who has an opinion, he sounds incredible, very knowledgeable, puts his arguments forward. How could I possibly dispute them? He knows a lot more than I do. Then the next day I listen to a different person with a different perspective. Sounds equally convincing because he's also very, very knowledgeable in an area. And you listen to both of them and you think, yeah, my opinion hasn't shifted. So I wanted to ask you, where do you get your information from if you want to make a decision on whether you think something like this is good or bad?
You're absolutely right. Many of these topics are very complicated and very complex. So if you really want to have your own informed opinion on something, What you have to do is read a lot, listen to a lot of people from the different perspectives, and then, of course, think for yourself. But something as simple in economics as a minimum wage, it simply has pros and cons. And then it comes down to how you value the pros and the cons. So even if you go through the entire literature on that topic, and there is a long literature on minimum wages and their effects, some things are not clear, some things are relatively clear, and then the question is, how do you value this? So how much do you appreciate some of the sort of positive effects of a minimum wage, and how do you think about and how much weight do you give to the negative effects? So how do I do it? Well, if there's a topic that I want to be informed about, every couple of months I have to vote on certain topics. There are some topics that are not particularly important to me, probably not as important to other people as well. I might then go with what certain people or parties say about it. Often, if they're not very controversial, many parties in Switzerland support a certain initiative or a certain reform. But if it's a controversial topic, I read what people have to say about it. Always from the left and the right. You always want to hear both opinions. And then you have to make up your own mind. The most important thing is that you source information from different people. You deliberately ask for the argument in favor, and then you ask deliberately for the argument against it. So if you're supporting, let's take a recent vote, if you were in favor of, building more highways in Switzerland, if you're in favor of this, ask specifically for the arguments against it and see if you're still in favor of it if you hear the other arguments. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's not clear because there are good arguments often on both sides, which is why it's a controversial topic. We're so clear that something is good or bad, then usually 80% are in favor or opposing it.
Controversial is a good word. That was a really great recommendation. And whilst we're on the topic still, I did want to get your view on the US and Musk's intention on also drastically cutting government spending. How similar is this, do you think, to Argentina in terms of what he plans to do? Or is it incomparable given the countries are so different?
I think it's mostly a sideshow. If you look at what Elon Musk and Vivek, what they're talking about, it sounds like they can cut so much spending and wasteful spending in the U.S. Government. And certainly there is some waste. Nothing is easier than to show some wasteful government spending. Then you look at the whole budget of the U.S. federal government, and you look at where most of that money is spent. Most of the money is spent on welfare in one way or another. And Donald Trump has made it clear that he wants no cuts to that part of the budget. So the most important part of the budget, we won't see any cuts. Then you have spending on the military and spending on interest. There's not going to be any cut there. So what is left? These are usually peanuts. So we will see nothing like what we observe in Argentina. It will be mostly a sideshow, and probably Trump understands that this is a narrative that can get him some votes. The narrative being government is too big and government is wasteful, etc. So you talk a lot about it, and it was probably a clever marketing move to hire Elon Musk for this. And certainly there's something he can do. It's not like he can do nothing. Changes are possible and improvements are possible. And it's a good idea to take someone, from the outside, maybe to take a fresh look at how things operate. But don't expect anything like what we see in Argentina.
Yeah, it does make me wonder why he picks Elon Musk and not a a professor in economics to do this job. It's got to be some kind of marketing campaign to essentially pull a celebrity in to play that role. Do you
Yes.
think Switzerland can benefit at the moment from decreases in government spending? Obviously not to the drastic degree of across the pond, but I've also been reading that there's also quite a lot of fat built up in the Swiss government, and I wanted to get your view on that.
Well, it depends on what you consider as fat. And quite frankly, the spending that we see here, the government spending we see here in Switzerland, is something that the voters have asked for. Now, take a recent example, the very fact that the pensions, there will be a 13 monthly payment. That is something that was supported by a majority of the people. Now, you might think, there's too much welfare spending in Switzerland. But then again, cutting it finds no majority. So where else do you want to cut if it's not welfare spending? Do you want to cut for the military? Do you want to cut on infrastructure spending? Where do you want to cut spending? Certainly there is some wasteful spending. But again, this is mostly at the margin. It's not like 20% of government spending is utterly wasteful and we can easily get rid of it. You can cut some of the spending, don't get me wrong. But then again, you are not a dictator. We live in a democracy. And for these kinds of reductions, even a 3% or a 5% reduction in government spending, it will be very hard to find a majority. And so you and I can agree that there are certain parts of the government budget in Switzerland that should be reduced. But unless you find a majority for that, I would say, it's pretty pointless to argue that these kind of reductions should happen, because that's your opinion. Fine. But sorry, the majority of the people here think otherwise.
That's very interesting to hear. Thinking about looking forward, are there any trends or developments going on which Swiss residents or policymakers should be particularly aware of when it comes to the future?
Yeah, most important development, I think, is that there's always, to some extent, a big narrative in the world. And the big narrative when I grew up, mostly in the 1990s and early 2000s, was that we have a globalized world. If you take a look at best-selling books of that time, you had books like The End of History, published in the early 1990s. End of history meaning we no longer have to fight about capitalism versus socialism. And we no longer have to fight about democracy versus dictatorship. It was clear we should all follow the American lead because America won the Cold War. So it was clear that we will all have market economies. We have deregulation. We have privatization. We have globalization. We will have free trade. The world will be flat. There was not the flat earth movement we have today. Friedman was talking about the flat earth in the sense that barriers to international trade would come down. There was a book published called The Global Village, in the sense that also values would converge, that the whole world would recognize that the values we have in the West, so to speak, are the best. And of course, it didn't take long, and you had 9/11 and you had the financial crisis and many other developments, and they have sort of changed over time the narrative. And so the narrative we have today is that geopolitical rivalry is back. Globalization is called into question. The rule of law internationally is called into question. So we're moving away from a world that is rules-based, and we're going back to a world order that is mostly power-based. And for Switzerland, that's not very good, because Switzerland is a small country and relies heavily on international trade and good relationships with other countries. And we would love to have a world that is rules-based. Think about it this way. You and I were probably weak. So if we walk outside here in Switzerland, we want to have a rules-based country, not a power-based one, because I don't have a gun. I don't have a big stick. I'm not very strong. If conflicts were solved by power in this country, we wouldn't like it. And so Switzerland is a small player in the international order, but it has to play by the rules which are set by the other big countries. And so the most important challenge I see for Switzerland is to navigate in a very different world. It's possible, but it's going to be very difficult, and it requires probably a different mindset. The worst thing you can do is to still think we are in this old narrative when the world has moved on, when the world is very different. So update your beliefs about, or your information about how the world works, especially if you grew up with a certain perspective. People tend to keep their perspective. They don't update their worldview. But I think we have to do that. The world is different from what was promised to us when we were younger.
Couldn't you argue that Switzerland has navigated the power dynamics of the world for the last 100 years very well?
Yes, Switzerland has navigated quite well in the past. So if you go to the first half of the 20th century, when there was a world war and then there was a second world war, Switzerland fared reasonably well during that period. However, the policymakers, the decision makers of Switzerland back then had a different mindset from the decision makers we have today. And that's not because today's decision makers are stupid, but today's decision makers grew up in a different world. And so we have to adapt. So yes, Switzerland can navigate in a different world and can be quite successful. It would still be better if the world was moving in that direction. But we can still be reasonably successful, even in a world of geopolitical conflict, to the extent that it doesn't turn into a nuclear war or something. But it requires a different approach. And so we probably should dust off some of our history books and see how we managed to build good relationships or decent relationships with countries that were on a very different policy trajectory than we are.
Is there any particular Swiss policy that you believe deserves more attention because of how much has gone into creating it or the benefits that we get from it, but there's no attention for it?
Well, there is some very important aspects about Switzerland that probably don't get as much attention. One might be the Swiss National Bank and the Swiss franc. We probably take it a little bit too much for granted that we have this currency which does what a currency is supposed to do, in the sense that it provides us with a stable money. Why is that so important? Well, think about it this way. Most people are in this very favorite position that they have more money today than they want to spend. So you have that challenge that some of your wealth has to be moved into the future. Now, if you have something like the Swiss franc, it's easy. You just keep your money. If you are in Turkey or in Argentina, you can't do that. So a functioning currency, a stable currency, is incredibly valuable. And so one of the things we should definitely do going into the future is make sure that the Swiss National Bank can continue to do its job. And so I recently wrote a piece with colleagues about it, arguing that we should really not undermine that important institution of the country. It should do what it's supposed to do, provide us with a stable currency and nothing else. If only they accomplish that, it's incredibly valuable. And you have to look around the world and you will find no country, virtually no country, that has a currency like we have. The only country that probably came close in recent times was Germany with its Deutsche Mark, and they got it, changed it for the euro. So I think people don't fully appreciate just how important that currency is for us. And so if I have one request, don't undermine it. Appreciate the fact that we have money which is so stable and over time appreciating quite a lot.
Yeah, I guess in some countries, in many countries, you need a degree in macroeconomics just to not lose your money. Like here, you can just put it in a bank account. Tomorrow, it'll be worth the same amount. Other countries, you have to be. My brother lives in, has lived for a while in Bolivia, and just the difficulty you have of ever having a shot of making money or leaving the country with money is just unbelievable.
Exactly. And that's sort of countries with very high inflation. But even if you just live in other European countries, I'll take Germany, or if you live in the United States, over the last couple of years, the purchasing power of your currency went down by about 20, 30%. That's a lot. So if you have built up through hard work and savings, maybe 30,000, 40,000 euros, and then just in a couple of years, because of inflation, you lose 20% of that, that really hurts. And you're absolutely right. What can you do to prevent losing, your wealth? Well, you then have to invest it into real assets. You buy stocks or you buy real estate. But that is something which is not free. It does come with some cost, and it does come with some risks. And you have to know what you're doing. If you go to the stock market and you don't know what you're doing, you might even lose more. So for many people, it is incredibly important that the currency is stable, so that they can just hold cash and it preserves its purchasing power. If only there is a little bit of inflation, like 3 or 4% a year over 10-year period, that eats away much of your savings if you don't get the respective interest on your savings account, which, for example, in Germany, you don't get.
Stefan, I have one last question for you before we wrap up, and that is, do you own any Bitcoin?
No, I don't earn any or don't hold any Bitcoin. But let me say one thing about it. It's for me an indication of a couple of things. First of all, it's a new technology, and it's fascinating because it's a new technology that is, as far as I understand it, set up in a way that you create something that is rare, and you can't just create more of it for technical reasons. And that is something which could work as a currency, as money. Go back, thousands of years, and what you see is that people use very rare mussels or stones or gold or silver. They were always looking for something which is very rare and thus, can be used if people agree on it as money. And so I cherish this idea that we find the 21st century equivalent of that. And Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are an attempt to create something very stable in this regard, sort of a digital gold, which then could be used in one way or another as money. However, it's sort of still early days of that technology. So you see the wild swings in the value against the dollar, which means right now it's more speculation rather than a currency. The big problem going forward for the cryptocurrencies is that if you think this will be used as money, I don't think the big governments of the world, the US government or European governments or the Chinese government, God forbid, they will not tolerate this. So the ability of a government to control the currency is an enormous lever of power. And I guarantee that the governments we have in the world will not tolerate losing that important part of their power. So any great hopes on the currency will run into a fight with governments. So I cherish the idea, and I would love to see sort of a good alternative to the kind of money you have in many parts of the world. Maybe not so much the dollar, but think about poorer countries that really struggle to set up a currency. For them, that could actually be quite a valuable innovation, because countries that struggle to provide a stable currency might tap into this modern technology to solve a very big problem.
Yeah, I am also quite moved by the story, which like the story is quite compelling. That's true, and I hope at least that it sticks around and becomes a store of value. So at least there is an option to hold it for countries and for people who don't have a currency which they trust in their own country.
And it could facilitate international payments. So if you want to wire some money, there are a lot of people, they come from very poor countries and they want to send money back, remittances. Often there are very large fees on that. So if you can reduce that, I'm all in favor of new technologies that helps us get the jobs done that people need to get done in a better way. And so, of course, there's a lot of fraud and there's a lot of speculation. There are a lot of negative things to say. But I'm more on the positive side. Focus on what could this technology be used for, important problems that we need to solve. And I see some potential there. But for the time being, I think it's very, very risky and very speculative, partially because we don't know yet which of these cryptocurrencies will eventually succeed and if anyone will succeed. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily putting your savings into it. But if you want to speculate a bit, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, that sounds ending on a positive note sounds perfect. Stefan, this has been an incredibly informative and enlightening conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in once again. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to like, subscribe, or share with a friend. It really does help me out. And don't forget, you can visit howitticks.ch for more details about episodes and links to topics we have discussed. You can also use the site to share your feedback. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time.